Gurubari, hello and welcome to the National Gallery of Australia. We begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, the custodians of the land on which we meet today and where the gallery stands. And on behalf of the gallery, I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And for any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers watching at home or joining us here in the gallery, thank you for joining us. And sorry that we're a little late. We're increasing the accessibility of our program, so we're just ironing out a few kinks. My name is Celeste Aldahn, and today we are bringing you an In Conversation with Annie O'Hare and Shaune Lakin, the curators of the Body Electric exhibition, a Know My Name project supported by the Medich Foundation. And if you're watching us from home, feel free to add any questions or comments into the chat box and we will discuss them at the end of the chat. So why don't we begin, Annie and Shaune, by chatting a little bit about your collaboration in the curation of the exhibition and perhaps touching on the title and how it speaks to the content of the show.
Yeah, thanks, yes. Celeste. Annie and I, we're both curators of photography here at the National Gallery, and we were asked by our director to put together a show for the Know My Name project, which is a project celebrating the work of women artists. A show that drew on our photo and moving image collection, and we took that and ran with it and decided to focus on what photo does best, which is kind of sex and looking at bodies and thinking about pleasure and sensuality and selling pleasure and sensuality. And because Anthony Medich and his wonderful foundation gave us some funds for this project, we were able to expand it so that it was the collection and lots of loans from artists around Australia and internationally. So we always work together. We don't do anything in this place without kind of consulting with each other. So the project just kind of emerged through our, I guess, conversations. And the title come to us, it's a really kind of common name for exhibitions, for songs, for all sorts of different things. Those of you who have seen the musical Fame will know the Body Electric. You know, like it's just, it's one of those kind of really common sort of titles, but it comes to us from a really beautiful poem by the queer American poet Walt Whitman called I Sing the Body Electric, and it's a poem that really talks about the body as a kind of, as a poetic experience. He makes no difference between male and female gender. All bodies are places for potential pleasure and sensuality. And it's a really beautiful poem, and we just kind of felt that given that we're talking about images of bodies by women artists, that the way that Whitman asks us to be really mindful of the sensual pleasure in bodies without sexualizing them was a nice way to start the show.
That's really beautiful. And I guess thinking about that and, thinking about the depiction of female bodies in art history, one thing that we know is that they're usually depicted by through the male gaze and by men. But this exhibition just totally flips that on its head, which is awesome. Mm-hmm. And I think most viscerally by Carolee Schneemann's 1960s work, Meet Joy. So I thought we'd begin there, and maybe you could give us a bit of insight into kind of the context that work was created in.
It's interesting with these early pioneering feminist artists. They came along at a time in the art world where, let's be honest, a lot of men were telling women what to think about their bodies. The whole history of psychoanalysis is sort of dominated by men, and, Freud and blah, blah, blah. And there are all those people who are just sort of telling women, how to be in the world. And these women come into that world and it's really dominated by very sort of macho, the abstract expressionism is sort of famously, chugging back the beer and, being sort of very, the very sort of, almost sort of they talk about, the paintbrush almost being Carolee talks about it almost being like a sort of phallic thing. So she sort of brings the body back into that place. And there's a lot of women thinking about how to be sort of active agents in the world around this time. And a little bit after Carol, people, a lot of sort of theorists thinking about the sense, particularly maybe somebody like wonderful feminist semiotic writer Hélène Cixous, saying that if you censor the body, you censor of the woman's body, then you also censor language and you censor the breath, and you sort of censor everything. So you've got to come back through the body.
Yeah.
So Carolee sort of says she sort of leaves the space of the painter and brings, comes back into and off the canvas and comes back into the space with the body and with that sort of that visceral nature of the body, and it's sort of just very joyful in that way, that it's an incredible work that done in the mid-60s. It's almost unbelievable to think of it.
Yeah.
So actually, like, Carolee's really important for us because we're photo curators. She's one of the kind of really pioneering figures in terms of our medium. She's a performance artist, but she's primarily interested in the way that photo and film sort of produce a sort of an image of the body that doesn't make sense to her. And so Meet Joy, which is the work we have in the show, which was a performance but lives now as a film, was a 16mm film that's now been transferred to video. It's a work that celebrates not just, I guess, the primacy of the body, and she is responding to action painting, to the idea that that painting with a body in action can somehow produce a kind of, a mark or an image that has meaning because it's expressive. And she understands the fallacy of that. And she also understands that that's a very particular way of thinking about making art, because it's about one person making a single mark that has meaning because it refers to that single person. Meet Joy brings together a bunch of people who don't know each other but who have been put through a rehearsal process by Carolee, who are not trained dancers or performers, and the meaning comes out of the fact that they're sort of dancing around this space with fish, with chicken carcasses, but with paint thrown on them as well. And so they're kind of enacting an action painting, but they're doing it together. So there's a kind of an idea of a community of, actually they were meant to be naked bodies, but she had to wear bikinis in the end because of, I guess, kind of concerns that the show was going to be shut down, which goes to Annie's point, about censoring the body. But, the photo and the film stuff with Schneemann's really crucial. We wanted to include a work in this show called Fuses, which she made between 1964 and 67, and it's a really amazing film that she made of her having sex with her partner, James Tenney. And it's very pornographic, but it's very, very beautiful. It's a really painterly depiction of two people engaging in the sex act. But the point of view of the film is the point of view of her cat Kitch. So it's kind of like the pussy's gaze. So she's playing on this kind of idea of like a woman, like finding a new way to kind of produce an image that makes sense of like a woman's experience of sex and pleasure. We couldn't show it because we just knew that it was just going to shut the whole show down, because it is, as I said, quite explicit. But we have bodies here anyway in terms of Meet Joy.
I love the notion of the fact that they're not sort of, often in the artists in this show aren't wanting to just sort of comment or, on the stereotypes or react to them in a way, but they want to just essentially start a new language. And a lot of the theorists at the time as well were interested in that notion of, language is created by the patriarchy, therefore is it even possible to get away from that way of being in the world?
Yeah.
And it's that notion of a really extraordinary project to try and do, to just, because we've all been brought up in it, so how can you not be complicit in it is really, so the sort of the critical lens that all the artists bring in this show to this sort of endeavour is very sort of anarchic and exciting, and just just something that they didn't even know. That I love that, for me, like that the artist who doesn't know where they're trying to get to, that I don't know sort of question, leading through intuition to all sorts of and being really courageous to sort of try to get away from that and thinking, or just commenting on it, just saying we're all complicit. We all see photography as something that we've been set up to see it as something that helps us consume things, to objectify everything. So how do you, can we even have a language in this fantastic filmmakers? One of the great pleasures for me in doing this project was to go back, it's sort of peripheral, but things happen in your life along with doing a show. So you're in every day, talking to Shaune, looking at the boards, and we have a wonderful time, going through the collection and putting things on boards. But then I was going home and watching some of those just extraordinary films from, the 60s and 70s, Barbara Loden's Wander and Chantal Ackerman and all those people who are just trying to find a new language to come back through the body. Chantal says something like, I just want people to, she does these things with extended time where you get really bored. And then she says, I just want you to come. Well, I don't get bored. We don't get bored, do we? It's wonderful. But she uses that time thing. And then she says, I just want you to come back into the body and to feel something. So that wanting to not only be active herself, but to bring out that sense of agency and activism in the viewer, so you get away from the passive consumer of these images to somebody who is also critically engaged and thinking, well, how do I live my life?
That was just, while you were both talking about that, I was thinking about, our journeys through life and maybe the generational conversations that are happening in this room, between someone like Carol Lee and then more contemporary artists. And in particular, I was reflecting on Fiona Paddington's works, the One Night of Love works, where she's taken these images from the past and kind of, I don't know if recontextualized them. And I wondered if you could give us a little bit of insight maybe about, what that does to those images or her process in selecting those images.
So those photographs by Fiona Paddington, first time that Fiona's work's been shown here at the National Gallery, which is really beautiful because she's such an amazing artist.
She's in New Zealand.
Yeah, are photographs that a friend of Fiona's found in a warehouse in London, and they were taken during the 1960s for a men's magazine. So they're kind of erotic images of women, some of whom look like they might be your wife or partner. Like there's a kind of a slightly everyday sort of like character or personality to a lot of the images. To the extent that even now it's quite hard to understand how they might have ever sort of functioned as erotic kind of objects. But Fiona's friend finds this cache of photographs from the 60s, and Fiona re-photographs them. And, it's a feminist act, and Fiona, sorry.
What's happened?
That's all right. Keep going. Justin will fix it up.
Fiona, we're back.
I wasn't listening to you, so I can't continue on.
Fiona re-photographs these images, which have basically become these anonymous, lost, pictures, and reinvests them with agency by naming her prints after friends of hers. So these women who have just become sort of anonymous, lost objects. Some of the photographs have been crossed out, so there's these really violent marks that an editor obviously placed over the prints or the negatives that cancel these women out. So Fiona re-photographs them, prints them as beautiful gelatin silver prints, and in many cases names them, as I said, after her friends. So there's this kind of effort to reinvest these lost anonymous objects with, with names, but also with a kind of a love, that the print kind of remembers or carries. It's Fiona's love, it's this idea that by re-photographing them and printing them really beautifully with gelatin silver, she can reinvest these lost things with a new kind of meaning that comes from her body. So they're very, very beautiful works.
Yeah, I love this quote by Fiona. I think it's included in the wall text. I think that photography is deeply sexy. It's got this fantastic capacity to seduce and excite. And I think it's definitely transformational, and a lot of the artists in this show do, show us states of transformation. I know in particular, Annie, you have a deep love of Francesca Woodman. So I was wondering if you might share with us a bit about, the states of transformation that she shares in her works.
I'm almost beside myself with excitement to have photographs by Woodman in the show. She's Gosh, I don't think that there's like a lot of bodies of work. Francesca was a teenager when she made these works. She's American. She'd grown up in this very arty sort of family. Both her parents are artists. Her mother's a very famous ceramicist. And so she grew up in this with this huge ambition and desire to make work. Yeah, she dies by the time she's in her early 20s, and she's made almost 500 prints or something. It's extraordinary. She went to at one point she boarded at school, and she was so ambitious and wanting to further her practice, like 13 or something, that she sleeps in the cupboard and uses the dorm room as a studio. But I guess from a very early age, she's been looking at a lot of art, all this history of art where women are objectified onto the canvas or into whatever. And she does this incredible project. And it doesn't mean anything, does it? But it's this incredible project where she gets the fact that this sort of notion that she's a woman with a man inside her looking at women. So this notion that she's sort of both sort of her own voyeur. So she's taking the images, she's behind the camera as the creative agent, and she's also in the photograph being sort of looked at, sort of objectified by herself. It's an extraordinary project. But she's very interested in this notion of art as a transformative practice. So she's always hard to pin down, and she sort of feels that women have been pinned down, named by men and so on. So she's sort of interested in working with that, both sort of being, not sort of something and or, but both, agent and, active and passive, subject and object, in this extraordinary way, which, could sort of be a way out of this sort of stop of how we get away from this male gaze. So she's playing with the male gaze. But the photographs are small, so they're intimate. You have to sort of come in to see them, and they sort of play with the notion of the abject. She's often in old buildings where she's sort of really sort of dirty and getting away from that sort of idealised way of being, that monstrous way of being that, a lot of people talk about, like a lot of the writers, about how, this notion of getting, you can come into the canon if you're sort of polite and you shave and stuff like that. But if you're monstrous, then you're not really welcome into that canon. So a lot of these artists, like Carolee and Linda Blenglis and Francesca, play with that notion of becoming something sort of too much. It's often excess or something, or the eels, or the sort of the real sort of basic stuff that's in her photograph. An extraordinary body of work.
That kind of moves quite nicely into the next question I had, which was really to open up a dialogue about, the use of surrealism through some of the works. And I just thought it was an interesting kind of thread between, the history of surrealism and the, interconnection with psychoanalysis and Freud and, the hysteria in a way, and maybe just that it's a current that runs through this show. I just find really interesting. In particular, Pat Brassington and Joanne Calais' works are just stunning. So is there anything that you'd like to share with us about those or their practice?
I guess the first thing to acknowledge is that the show is really partial. It could have been 3 times the size it is, like any shows like that. But I think what I'm just trying to acknowledge there is that in a way the selection of work probably reflects a lot of Annie and my own kind of like positions or desires or interests, and I think we both share an interest in the way that surrealism and photography kind of converge. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that. We are both really interested in photographic surrealism, but definitely in the show you can see it in Carolee Schneeman's work, as you say, in Pat Brassington and Joanne Calais. A lot of the women who we found ourselves drawn to, who are interested in making pictures that engage with a woman's experience of pleasure, desire, sexuality, were drawn to the way that the surrealists themselves tried to package women's sexuality, particularly photographically. So, the work by Pat Brassington and Joanne Calais explicitly draws on a kind of like set of images that that the surrealists were themselves really interested in, that came out of a hospital in Paris from the 19th century that appeared to sort of depict women in states of hysterical convulsion. Really, really famous photographs, and really important photographs in terms of like the history of surrealism. The surrealists kind of used these or understood that these photographs kind of represented a new kind of poetic taxonomy, so a kind of a language or an alphabet of women in ecstatic, poetic states of kind of ecstasy. But in fact, what the photographs depicted were women who were purported to be experiencing kind of hysterical symptoms. So their neuroses was kind of manifesting itself in these kind of bodily convulsions. They were photographs of women in these states. So there's a kind of an interesting convergence with the way that the surrealists kind of, drew on these photographs around the way that a woman's sexuality was being used by avant-garde artists in a very specific way. Women were being positioned, women's sexuality was being positioned in a very specific way by male artists, who were, in this case, were surrealists. So someone like Pat Brassington, certainly someone like Joanne Callis, is trying to kind of rip apart this assumption that the avant-garde has made around like its right to make use of images of women in quote-unquote sexual or feeling sexual experiences. And so the iconography of hysteria is a big part of the work. Pat Brassington has been drawing on that iconography for 30 or 40 years, again as in an effort to sort of, I think, de-link, the image of a woman in some kind of ecstatic state from the way that, that psychiatry, psychoanalysis, avant-garde artistic practice have tried to sort of position that image as something that is very passive, that doesn't have any voice, that doesn't actually experience any pleasure. All of those things are responded to in Joanne's amazing photographs and in Pat's as well. Annie, do you want to add anything?
I just love the domestic sort of, they often take place in these little domestic scenes, and it's just that notion, I think we all completely know, that just lurking at the, running along the side of the sort of dingy carpet is, just the spectre of monstrosity and that fear that we have of losing control. Yeah. So I love, it's interesting, we did the boards, they just looked very pink for a while. There's a lot of sort of pink, but, and certainly they're both very interested in both started off in black and white, but then became interested in the notion of colour as being sort of an emotion, giving it a bit of an emotional kind of like Joanne, she looks back to earlier colour photographers and sees how they've sort of used colour to sort of up the sort of the emotional sort of thing that's happening in the work. And Pat says, you might think that I was just using pink to sort of feminise the work or something, but she said, it's something like, it's much more nasty than that. She's like, pink smothers. Yeah. So that's sort of that, growing up, they both probably grew up around the same time in the 50s and 60s, where, that notion of, I'm not very good on Freud, but that notion of, what you repress then comes out in some sort of strange manifestation. So it's just, there's always just that humour in them. I also like the fact I didn't know about Joanne's work, that a lot of these images made in the 70s, they always seem to me made like last week or something, were just sort of made, she often didn't show them at the time. She was working on other projects, studying in San Francisco, and she's in LA, isn't she? In LA. I knew that, down south. And so she's, but almost, and it's, she's a very like amazing teacher and amazing artist. She's not like sort of working all the way in private, but a lot of these were almost like they almost are coming out of that that need to make this work, which I just really love. But all the little strange, I love, when I never look at things very well, but I was just looking at them and, the little chains around the shoes and so on, those strange little things that are in the photographs that just, and the same with Pat. Like sometimes they look normal, they don't look normal at all, but sometimes it sort of looks, and then just that little push, and she works digitally, she felt digital way of working really freed her up, but just that little strange little thing that happens that just sort of like, it's like, the world is really weird, let's be honest.
It is.
I'm really weird and like that, and that's all good.
It is. Well, we've got about 5 minutes before we take questions from Facebook, and there's so much more that I want to talk about. But I thought maybe we should open it up for the two of you to touch upon a few things that we haven't been able to so far before we start taking questions.
I guess one of the parts of the show that we both really love is the little section that deals with the way that photographers have drawn on the family album as a kind of a way of, I guess, producing an image of a life developing or a community developing. So figures like Nan Goldin, Pixie Lau, and a really amazing Chinese-American artist, Momo Akabe, a beautiful Japanese photographer that Annie and I both adore, are all working with the family album, so producing images of their experience of domestic life, of family life, and non-normative family life, so Pixie, really complicates what a family album looks like in a really conventional sense by producing these beautiful archives, or a beautiful archive of images that records her intimate relationships. And so I think that we're interested in the way that some of the women artists that we were drawn to were themselves attracted to some of the really sort of basic conventions of photography. So the family album is kind of a photographic experience that we all share. So drawing on that very shared sense of photography as something that helps to make sense of community or family, but also helps to kind of produce an image of it as it grows. That's a really beautiful part of, I think, one part of the display that we both find quite moving because of the way that in every case those three photographers are complicating what for many people is a really troubling space. I hate looking at like my family's family album. I hate seeing photographs of myself as a young kid for whatever reason, but for some reason like there's this beautiful power that's kind of reinvested into the family album by these amazing artists.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, Nan comes from a beautiful, I love all three photographers, but Nan is sort of the godmother of this whole sort of genre in a way, using sort of like a diary, but she's very critically engaged, but sort of uses the snapshot. And I love, she makes a great comment about how, the photographer is often seen as a voyeur, and but she's like, in last one invited to the party, but she's like, this is my party, these are my people, these are, she always had the camera. It's a way of actually building relationships. So to sort of like really, for her to, in a really moving way, to assert that this was my life, and by making these photographs in this way, no one can sort of take that away from me. No one can take away the validity of this experience that I've been through. It's a bit more complicated than that, but there's a sort of an authenticity that comes through with this work that is just, it's incredibly engaging, that thing that you've been the sort of privilege of being invited into this person's life. Of course, because it's photography and there's power or questions, it's always a bit more complicated than that. But there is that notion that she's always talking about, and trying to get away from that notion of other people being over there, of sort of saying, I never photograph stuff that I wouldn't be myself happy to be photographed in. And she's in the images herself. She's part of that family. They're her chosen family. They're her she uses the term tribe. And, she uses it, and it's moving as well. She uses it, as all photography does, to sort of build connections. She says, I took all these photographs and put them together to keep these people close to me. Yeah. And, working in the 80s in the gay scene in New York and the trans, she said, what it in the end has reminded me of is how much I've lost. Yeah. So there's a real beautiful sort of, just about the world and how we go through it and how we lose things. It's a really beautiful body of work.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing. Now we do have time for questions from Facebook, but I think we're still waiting on them to come through. So if you are watching online, feel free to add some questions into the comments box. And while we're waiting, I might ask, you guys a question myself. There was a question I had written down here that I was curious to chat about, the work of Annette Messenger and Lillian O'Neill, and this idea of pulling apart and kind of putting back together and fragmentation that you touched upon before. I just wondered if that was, a thread that you see running through the whole show, or if there was anything you'd like to add about that as one of the concepts.
I guess traditionally the idea of fragmenting the body, cutting it up, putting it back together again, a lot of women have used that from almost the very beginning of photography in very particular ways. It's quite anarchic, just to cut everything up, and and then you build your own story. So again, it's a very active way of being. And I guess one of my favourite photographers also is in the show, a woman called Christine Godin, who was working in San Francisco in the 70s. Again, a very short sort of period of working as an artist. Christine sort of moved on to other things, came back and ran a gallery as a director. But this again, it's something about, maybe some people know that they're not going to work. There's an intensity that comes in some of that work. But I guess, and also about the fragment is, it's just on a very simple way. If you're just, and there's beautiful stuff, and the Whitman has that intensity of looking. He often talks about bits of the bodies that he's seeing, mostly the bulge and the trousers, but other things as well. The beauty of the body, but you're just getting close, I guess, in a very sort of easy, sort of simple way.
Yeah.
That notion, if you're, that far away from someone, then you've made a connection. You can't sort of stay way back and just objectify it out there.
Yeah.
So there is, just on that very simple level,
Nice.
and that sort of fetishism that sort of comes through it, because we all like that. That sort of notion of what makes us, what electrifies our bodies.
Maybe speaking of fetishism, we do have one question from Facebook so far, from Darren. They've asked, in regards to Cindy Sherman in the show, I am wondering about the choice of the mannequin image, which happens to be one of my favourites. Great choice, Darren. Almost any of her images would have fit into the show. Could you talk about your choice in including this one in particular?
Yeah, thanks, Darren. It's true that any of Cindy Sherman's photographs, or many of Cindy Sherman's photographs, could have gone into the show. We liked the mannequin work because it plays on the language of pornography, like she sets the mannequin up, which is a medicalised kind of representation or depiction of the body. She sets it up according to one of the really basic pictorial tropes of pornography, so the body being sort of opened up and ready and waiting for penetration. I mean, it's the most sort of rudimentary but equally hilarious, but also really confronting responses to the way that women have been positioned and packaged by and through pornography that you could find. So for us, it was completely self-evident that photograph had to be in the show. Having said that, that's the photograph that confronts most people who come to the show. There are photographs that have penises, there are photographs that have vaginas, there are photographs that have all sorts of different actual body parts, but it's the plastic body parts that seem to throw most people to the extent that it's just like, there's something very creepy about dolls. The surrealists kind of made that really clear.
And if anybody does abject, well, it's
Cindy Sherman.
Just some of those ones is full of vomit. I just can't even look at them.
Maybe we'll take another question from Facebook. We have one from Chelsea. Could you talk about the Sophie Calais works in the show and how they speak to the other works?
It was interesting. Sophie was a little bit of a. She's so hilarious. I mean, in fact, she was actually a late edition and came galloping through. And I was saying to Shaune, he's like, I wish we had the. So this is a little bit in secrets. I wish she had the striptease works and stuff. And I'm like, I know, right? And I said, there's some book. We've got some book by Sophie downstairs. I've never bothered to even look at it or something like. I'll go down and have a look what it is. And then it was the striptease book. So I felt like a bit of an idiot, one could say. But in terms of the way that photography works in that way of, the woman as object and surveillance, and that way, those great projects that Sophie's done about, following guys around Venice and just, and that idea of just the transgressive nature of photography. You can't get much better than Sophie Calle, so she certainly...
We should say, for people who have never seen the book, that it's a book of photographs taken of Sophie doing stripteases in the Pigalle region of Paris, and Sophie did actually work as a striptease artist in the late 1970s to sort of pay her way. And
the line between fact and fiction with Sophie is often a little difficult to...
And the great thing about the photographs is that Sophie has this look of absolute contempt on her face all the time, and her thing was she would do these stripteases and she would look at the men with such contempt, you know, like that was her thing. So anyway, there's a really cute kind of play on, you know, I guess the artist as performer, the artist is having to sort of satisfy their audience, the striptease artist having to satisfy their audience, and of course Sophie just throws all of that around. It does, like, you know, have a relationship to a lot of work in the show, but that's a nice question. Thanks, Chelsea.
Nicely between the personal and, you know, like sort of, it's based on her personal life, and yet it's really about much larger topics. The way that Sophie plays between those two things is always extraordinary and really playful, and just and you know, it's hard to look away from the Sophie Calle image.
Yeah, we have one more question from Facebook from Stephen. You couldn't show Fuse. Were there other works that you wanted to show but you felt that you couldn't?
There were works that we actually couldn't show. Fuse we self-censored because we just knew that it was going to cause a problem. There were a couple of instances of works that showed erect penises that we kind of had to seriously reconsider including, to the extent that we didn't in the end. There are works that we wanted to show or might have shown that just didn't fit in because we have limited space. So Anne Ferren's I'm the Rehearsal Master, which draws on those photographs of hysterics that I referred to before. That's an amazing work in our collection that would have been perfect alongside the Fiona Paddingtons, for example. There's a lot of work that we could have included but didn't, and there's some work like Fuse that we just couldn't show because we knew that it was going to really push away a lot of people. Yeah, really great question, but yeah, of course there's always things that don't make the cut in the end.
And right, we've talked quite a lot too about the fact that this show isn't like, you know, it sort of talks about notions around pornography, you know, like things with the Fiona Paddington and so on, but maybe it's just a reflection of us. Again, it's not, and you know, of course it wouldn't be, but you know, a lot of the, you know, I looked at a lot of books, you know, women on women in the 70s, sort of feminist, you know, sort of projects, which were basically sort of just soft porn, and they're just not very interesting. I think the sort of critical gaze that these artists bring to this whole endeavour, thinking about the male gaze and the female gaze and empathy and all those sorts of things, is just a lot more interesting than, you know, just watching, you know, it's much more sort of like just straightforward depictions of those sorts of images. But it's always maybe a little bit of a balancing act. When you do a show like this, you don't want to just not have anything, you know, it's a show about sex after all, in a sense, or desire. I'm always more interested about the idea of being seduced by an image in a more sort of abstract way, perhaps. Maybe we both are, perhaps.
Well, maybe we'll end it there. Thank you so much for your time today, Annie and Shaune. Thank you to our in-person audience, who we'd like to invite to stay for a moment once we finished so that we can answer any of your questions. And thank you for watching us from your homes or desks, wherever you are today. And thanks again to the Medich Foundation for your support on this exhibition. We're hosting live streams on Facebook regularly each month. So join us again next time and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Celeste.
So if anybody does have